Welcome, folks. Thanks very much for joining us today. It is a small crowd, so you will get a personalised presentation from us today, but I hope you find it to be of value. So it is an important topic, of course. Restructures and redundancies are never easy, and there's a number of compliance-related risks that need to be kept in mind. So today we're sharing a few tips and tools as to how you can best manage these processes, both from a staff communication consultation perspective, but also from a compliance perspective. So thanks for joining us. There will be a Q&A session at the end, but given that we're a small group, if you have anything you'd like to raise as we move through, please put it in the chat. Just before we commence today's presentation, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. So we recognise and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay respect to elders past and present. We also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us today. Thank you. Okay, a little bit about us. I won't spend too much time on this because we're known to most of you, but we've been around since 2007, based in Penrith, basically providing HR support and recruitment support to small to medium-sized businesses. Something makes us a little bit different perhaps than some is that we don't operate under any retainers, subscriptions or lock-in contracts. We rely on the quality of our service to retain our clients. And we're a small team, particularly at the moment. It's Margot and I. So if you're ring, you always know who you're dealing with, and we get to know you, and that achieves a better outcome overall. Combined experience, we just whisper this quietly, don't we, Margot? Combined,
We do.
have over, it's probably 60 years
Probably
now.
is. Oops.
Anyway, we'll keep that quiet. But anyway, we've been around a while and like to think we've picked up a few things. Okay, so just in terms of the protocols of today's session, it is being recorded. Thank you for that. Please, just to avoid any background noise, if you can mute unless you're saying something, use the chat function if you want to ask a question as we go, although of course there'll be the opportunity at the end. And we will be providing a copy of the recording as well as the presentation to you today or tomorrow once I get that organised. We will also be sharing a copy of our Terminating Employment Managing the Risks guide. So keep an eye out on your emails for that as well. So in terms of the session today, we're just going to do a bit of an introduction to restructuring, what it is, or what we mean by that term, and give you a few tips as to how to manage a restructuring process. The bulk of the session will be on getting it right, making sure that you meet your compliance obligations as an employer in respect of managing change and redundancies. So Margot will do the heavy lifting for us in regards to that. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Okay, so just a couple of things that we need to say at the start. The information we're sharing with you today relates to employers and employees covered by the National Workplace Relations System, all the Fair Work stuff, which pretty much covers all of us on this call today. It is general information that we're sharing with you today. It's not formal or legal advice, and nor can it possibly cover all the possible scenarios, contingencies that sometimes come into play when you're looking at restructures and redundancies. So if you do need guidance that takes account of your individual situation, please do reach out to us. Okay, so just moving into the presentation proper, restructuring intro and tips. So what do we mean by restructure? Well, for the purposes of this session, sorry, Margot, I think you just need to.
Got it.
For the purposes of today's session, we're using the definition of restructuring that is pretty much an essential part of all of the modern awards. So when they talk about changes that require consultation and all that sort of thing, they're talking about major changes in production program, organisation structure or technology. And this is the important bit, that are likely to have significant effects on employees. So those significant effects might include things like termination of employment for reasons of redundancy, for example, changes to the composition of the workforce, a reduction in the depth and breadth of positions available within the organisation, changes to hours of work, or job transfers or relocations. So we're not talking here about minor tweaks to job roles or, moving chairs around too radically. This is more substantial change that may have a significant effect on employees. And those changes may come about for a range of reasons, just financial pressures. It's a tight market at the moment. I think we all know that. So sometimes we need to make difficult decisions in response to those changes. So it could be financial pressures, could be the introduction of new technologies, which are, decreasing the volume of work that's available or necessary. You're just streamlining operations. You're looking to improve efficiency and profitability. So for any or all of those reasons, you might be looking at a restructure. Just something to say up front, which Margot may cover a little bit as well, but restructures should never be seen as a substitute for managing an individual's poor performance. We sometimes do get that. People just say, well, this person's not working out. It's a pain in the neck to sort of try and manage their performance. It takes a long time. Can't we just make them redundant? We can have a conversation about that, but as a general rule, restructuring should not be seen as a substitute for effectively managing someone's performance. Okay, so why do you need to get it right? Well, there's a number of claims that you could be presented with if you don't get it right. The primary types of claims that you may be exposing yourself and your business to are unfair dismissal claims and general protections claims. Now, an unfair dismissal claim could come, for example, if the people that were affected by that change feel that it wasn't in fact a genuine redundancy. It's a bit of a sham because they just didn't like me, or they didn't, it was more a performance issue and they're just using a redundancy as an excuse to get rid of me. That could result in an unfair dismissal claim. You could also be presented with a claim if it's felt that you haven't gone through an appropriate consultation process, or, of course, if you've not met your obligations in respect of providing a period of notice or redundancy pay if that's due. The other type of claim is general protections claim, which is a bit more complicated. But basically, if somebody feels aggrieved by a redundancy, for example, and they feel that that redundancy didn't happen for genuine reasons, but happened for unlawful reasons, such as they had made previous complaints in the workplace and, you just didn't want troublemakers or something. If they felt that there was some merit to that and that was in fact the reason for the decision, then you could find yourself with a general protections claim. Or if they felt that it was based on discriminatory grounds, etc. Okay, we want to avoid those types of things. There's a whole heap of reasons: time and hassle, potential compensation awarded up to 6 months' pay for an unfair dismissal claim, or damages can be actually uncapped for general protections claims. So we obviously want to take steps to avoid those sorts of claims, which is the bulk of the presentation that Margot will take you through, is designed to help you address those sorts of issues. Okay, so before we get to the compliance stuff, just a few tips on restructuring and how you go about the process. So one thing we'd say there is to be very clear upfront about your rationale for the change. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Just be very clear about that. And then initially, at least, it's very easy. Many business owners will automatically, and I can understand why, focus on the people. What does this mean? Oh, gee whiz, that person's been here such a long time and all that sort of thing. They start to think about the people. What we would strongly suggest is that initially, at least, when you're thinking through what sort of outcome you want, think about the actual structure of the business, what's going to achieve and sustain success in your business. Think about the structure in those terms and then start to think about, well, what are the potential implications for the team? So that's a good tip we've got for you. Be aware of your obligations. Obviously, that's part of the content of today's session. One thing that we would advise, even before you get too far into it, is to understand what obligations you may have in respect of notice payments and redundancy payments. If you're a larger business, as in 15 or more, and you've got some long-term staff, redundancies can be pretty expensive. Ultimately, you save that person's salary cost, of course, so there are savings to be made, but there can be a significant upfront cost if you're required to pay redundancy payments. So before you go into it, make sure that you've got some sense of what that might be and that you can afford it. Have a plan. We don't just go into a new market. We don't just start manufacturing a new product without having a plan. So we shouldn't approach a restructure without a plan. Think about how you're going to communicate this internally within the business and to external stakeholders ultimately. How are you going to manage the consultation process? Who's going to do that? When is it going to happen? What about the tasks such as amending job descriptions, org charts, um, calculating the costs and all those sorts of things? All those need to be considered. And you probably also need to be considering what about after the restructure is done. Often they can generate some tension, some uncertainty in the business. So you need to think about what you're going to do to manage those issues even after impacted people might have left. Another piece of advice, don't go in with a closed mind. As business owners, we like to think that we know a lot and we've got plenty of answers. We may not have all the answers. So go into a consultation process with a genuinely open mind. You never know, you may actually achieve a better result by listening to some other options. And of course, seek specialist support. These can be quite complex areas. They can expose your business to considerable risk. So if and when you need to, seek support. Okay, so that's a little bit of an intro to restructuring and a few tips. The compliance element is particularly important. So I'll hand over to Margot.
Thank you, Greg. And welcome everybody, and thanks for your time today. So I'm going to talk you through the compliance related steps around getting redundancies in particular right. And one thing I just want to say upfront is, and I have this conversation with clients a lot, we do this work quite regularly. It's never an easy process to do. It's not easy for you guys. It's not easy for us either, because at the end of the day, these are people and these are people's lives that we're playing with. So we always make it quite clear that the intention around this is around it's focused on the job, not the individual. And it's all around then treating that individual with, some respect and dignity and allowing them to leave the business in a professional and respectful way. There are essentially, though, three components to this process. The first, and we will talk through these in some detail, but these, and that's what we'll follow on with. The first is ensuring that the redundancy is genuine, and I'll talk to what a genuine redundancy is and what it is not. Talking, as Greg said, around the consultation process and how that needs to happen, and then the technical pieces around notice, redundancy pay, and payment of entitlements to those who are affected. So let's talk in the first instance to a genuine redundancy. So under Australian employment law, a genuine redundancy is one where the employer no longer requires the person's job to be performed by anyone due to changes in operational requirements. And what that means from a purely people-related perspective is that the focus of this is on the job, not the individual, and it's the role. It's the entirety of the role, as opposed to individual tasks and responsibilities that might fall within that role. And I'll give an example of this in the next slide. But that is key, that the role is no longer required to be done by anybody. And then to be genuine, it also needs to comply with the applicable award, agreement, contractual obligations, which I'll talk through in a second as well. The final component to a genuine redundancy is that redeployment within the business or the business's associated entities, if there are any, has been considered but isn't reasonably practical or possible. So here's a very, very simple example of what might be considered a genuine redundancy. So an employee is working in a customer service role. There's going to be a new system introduced, a new CRM or something, but to the extent that that system is introduced, there will be components of that person's role that are now going to be automated, and little pieces of the job, like customer service inquiries, can be managed by other people. So the tasks of handling inquiries and processing orders are still there, but the full scope of the job doesn't need to be done by a single employee anymore. So in that case, that would likely be considered a genuine redundancy. The second component, which is a large component, is around the consultation process. So in the past, there have been examples, and I've seen examples of this, where an employer will simply say to a person on the day, look, I've done some thinking and I really don't need your role anymore. So guess what? You're redundant. You finish today. That won't fly, unfortunately, from a consultation perspective. That's informing. That's not consulting at all. Most awards and most employees are covered by modern awards in some shape or form. Most awards have very specific requirements to consult, and there's usually a clause in each award that is titled Consultation about Major Workplace Change, and that outlines the steps you have to go through. They very rarely differ from awards, but it is important to check each one just to be certain. So generally speaking, consultation is required as soon as the decision has been made to make the changes that might have the significant effect on people, which, as Greg said earlier, is around either termination, changes to workforce composition, reduction in opportunities, changes to hours. It could be things, and I've seen this, I've actually experienced this in a past life, where the business relocated from literally one side of the harbour to the other, and that was a significant change because of the impact on people's travel time, work-life responsibilities, all of those sorts of things. So the consultation process had to be initiated at a very early stage. So this is really, for example, we think we're moving ahead with this versus it's a done deal. And as soon as you think you're moving ahead with it, you need to commence the process to consult about what the impact or effect is going to be before you actually implement or bring about that change. So what the consultation typically involves, and I'll go into this again in a bit more detail in the next slide, is notifying people that might be affected that there are proposed changes coming, giving them information on those changes and what might the effects be, talking with them individually about how you might avoid, minimize, mitigate the adverse effects, which is usually the wording in the awards of those changes on them, and genuinely considering ideas that they might come up with. So let's talk about what that looks like in the long form process. It's effectively 4 steps, and this is the way that I usually phrase it with people, so I hope that this sticks. Step 1 is tell them you're thinking about it. Step 2 is talk to them about it and what it means for them. Step 3 is think about what they have to say about it. And then step 4 is tell them what you've decided. So In step one, what you would be doing is briefly advising people of the changes. And ordinarily, that first step is a fairly quick one. We're thinking about doing this. Here's a letter that confirms that. We want to have a chat with you about it in further detail. We don't expect you to respond right now. We need you to have some time to go away and think about it. So we will be having a one-on-one consultation with you in the coming days to talk it through in more detail. And then the second step is the one-on-one consultation meeting. And what happens in this is that you would actually be telling people in more detail what the proposed changes are, focusing again on the role, not on them as a person, talking to them about potential redeployment opportunities if they exist, but most importantly in this meeting, seeking their feedback and suggestions on what might be done to mitigate the effects. So this could be things like the employee saying to you, for example, well, I think I could potentially do Fred's job, or there's a vacant job of X over there and I think I could do that. Or, well, maybe I could drop from full-time hours back to part-time hours. A whole range of different things. And then as a result of that, there is a further meeting scheduled for you to then advise them of the decision. In between that, there is that process or that period of you considering those options and properly considering those options before you make the final decision. They may well come up with something that you just genuinely hadn't thought about that is a legitimate option that you could actually implement that may, in some shape or form, prevent the redundancy from going ahead. And that's what this process of consultation and then considering the options is all about. So what that process would typically take, or the length of time that would typically take, would be up to a week. You can usually do it in a week, but there's a few things to remember in that. The first is that there should be a break of at least 24 hours between each meeting, because that then allows the person adequate time to prepare, to think, to arrange a support person if they would like to, because they are able to bring a support person to those subsequent meetings after they've been told that this thing's being considered. It also, though, gives you adequate time to properly think through what they've offered as suggestions. Now, sometimes people will have no suggestions at all, and that's okay. That means that it's probably going to be a slightly shorter meeting. But in the event that they do, you need to be seen to be properly considering those. So this is about going into the process without having a predetermined outcome obvious to anybody. It's important to, I think, when you're doing this process, to think about the timing of when these meetings are happening. So, for example, if you've had a consultation meeting with people on a Wednesday and you need to consider options, it may be appropriate then to advise them of the outcome on a Friday. I would hesitate to leave people hanging over a weekend. I think that can be unfair on people to do. So just be careful and cautious about, and you'll know the individuals better, when those meetings take place in terms of the length of time that then does lag in between, especially over weekends. And do remember, as you're going through this process, that this will be having an impact on others in the business as well. So you may want to consider how you're communicating with those people throughout this process too. Some specific tips around the consultation process. The first is take detailed notes during all of these meetings. In the consultation meeting in particular, take detailed notes. You don't require a response to whatever the options they're coming up with there and then. And in fact, we'd encourage you not to give responses there and then, because you need to be seen to be genuinely considering what they've said. So you could use words like, I'll think about that, or I'll take that on board, or I'll need to talk to Fred about that as well, rather than responding there and then. If they do come up with things that may be options and you're not sure of what that means or how that might actually work, You're allowed to ask questions, seek clarification of matters that are raised. If they say, well, I might work part-time, well, what would that look like? How many hours were you thinking about? You understand, I assume that means that your remuneration would reduce. Have you considered that? Those sorts of things. Keep the lines of communication open. So when you've commenced these meetings, you'll still see this person, presumably, around the office or around the worksite, wherever they may be. And there is nothing to stop you from having further discussions, bearing in mind that there is process around that, and support people should be available and all those sorts of things. But you can continue to seek clarification between the consultation meeting and the decision meeting. You could have an additional meeting to seek further clarification if that's required. Consult with external people if you need to. You can talk to us, of course, at any time. The person may have raised something that you're just not sure about the legalities of. Talk to us if that's the case. And engage with relevant others if you need to. For example, if you need to talk to directors or other team members or other managers in the business to explore the options, do that. And again, keep notes of those discussions as well. Everything, the more that you have in writing around how you've gone through this consultative process, the better positioned you will be in the event that there's a claim that this wasn't a genuine redundancy process. The final point there is around access to an EAP, an employee assistance program. If you have one, they can be very valuable during this process. It is advisable, if you do have one and you are using one, to let the EAP service know upfront that you're going down this track and that they may get some calls. Because remember that throughout this process, you still have a duty of care for your employees, including around psychosocial risks. So you may get people who are quite distressed by this process and may benefit from speaking with someone who is external to the process and external to the organisation to just get some additional levels of support. Okay, we now are moving on to some specific issues that you might need to consider that may have an impact on the way that the process flows or the way that you undertake that process. The first is you may be a business where no award or enterprise agreement is in place. Even without one of those things in place, the Fair Work Act still applies, which means that the redundancy still needs to be genuine, the role no longer required, redeployment considered, and all of those sorts of things. Our advice is generally, if you are going to undertake this process, whether the person is covered by an award or agreement or not, to follow this same process, because it's been seen by the Commission to be a structured, fair and transparent process, and therefore it will reduce the risk of these claims coming forward. So even if there is no award or agreement in place, this sort of a process is considered to be best practice. From a general protections perspective, and Greg talked a little bit about general protections a minute ago. For example, an employee recently made a complaint, or an employee has expressed certain political views, those sorts of things. If they have done that, then extra caution around this sort of process is needed, because it's unlawful to take adverse action, which includes a redundancy, because an employee has exercised a workplace right. So the best practice around this is, again, to make sure that you have clear and documented evidence that the redundancy is due to a business reason, not due to the complaint or the exercise of that workplace right. But again, consider seeking advice if you're uncertain, or if you think that there might be any risk that it's related to something else, or might be claimed to be related to something else. Greg talked in his presentation on the restructuring components that people under performance management should be kept separate if possible. It is not always possible, but you cannot and should not use redundancy as a way to terminate an underperforming employee, because it could be seen as an unfair dismissal. The key distinction here is that performance management relates to an individual's conduct or capability, whereas redundancy is about the role being no longer required. That's the key distinction. So the best practice is, if redundancy is genuine, pause the performance process and ensure that the decision is based on the business need, not the performance issues. And again, keep thorough records to support that decision. One thing that can arise is that you can have multiple employees in similar roles. For example, you could be reducing from a sales force of 5 down to a sales force of 3, in which case, what do? Who do you talk to? The first thing is that what you would need to do is to discuss and to consult with all those impacted. So that would be all 5 people. Again, going through clear communication on why the change is occurring, then having individual consultations, as well as potentially a group consultation if appropriate. So you may tell all 5 as a group up front, this is what we're thinking about doing, and then move into individual discussions. Again, you would go through that process of people providing specific feedback before you get to decisions. But what you will really need in this phase, which is particularly important, is very objective, fair, and justifiable selection criteria on why you have selected the 3 to be made redundant versus the other 2. So we would suggest for this that you have a selection matrix which has skills, experience, business needs, etc. on it, and that you avoid discriminatory factors on that matrix. For example, age, disability, the amount of sick leave that they've taken, all of those things could be pulled back to general protections reasons for terminating someone. Again, you would provide the opportunity for redeployment if possible. And then the final point is around survivor syndrome. So it's important to remember that the people who are left behind are going to be feeling demoralized, anxious, and potentially quite disengaged after this. So it's important to have, as Greg said again, a change management plan in train for those people as well, where you are transparent with them about the reasons for the change and the futures of the organisation, that you acknowledge the impact it's having on them and support them through with communication, engagement, etc. Again, it could be offering the EAP to those people if required. One of the things that I've found particularly effective when you have to go through this process with those left over is to pull them together after the process and let them know quite clearly that you're finished. It's done. We're moving on from this point. That goes back to how well you've done that restructure and how well planned it's been in the first place. So that measure twice, cut once principle, where you can now say to everyone, genuinely, we are finished. It's been difficult, but let's move forward. And you may want to consider some strategies to specifically do that around, team building, for example, just to build up that or re-establish that level of trust. And as Greg said, don't forget the admin that goes with the changes. So new reporting lines, amended position descriptions, org charts, all that sort of stuff. That will be particularly important for the survivors because they will need some clarity around what this now means for them moving forward. Okay, let's talk about the statutory entitlement stuff. So this slide represents the statutory entitlements. These are the minimums that must be payable, but you will need to check awards, agreements, contracts as well, just to make sure that they are consistent with either the National Employment Standards or not. And if not, then obviously you need to honour what is in the agreement or the contract. So the first is the provision of notice or payment in lieu of notice. And what it says in the National Employment Standards is that based on the length of service the person has, they are entitled to 1 through 4 weeks of notice. That said, there is an exception to that, and that is an employee who is over the age of 45 who has completed at least 2 years of service. They receive an additional 1 week of notice. So the maximum notice that is payable or paid in lieu would be 5 weeks. So a couple of things to note here, though. You can either have somebody work through their notice period, or you can pay them in lieu of notice. If you're paying them in lieu, you need to pay that notice before the employment period terminates, and the employment ends immediately that the notice is then payable. If you are having somebody work through, then the notice or the employment ends on the last day that they work. That may therefore increase or change their leave entitlements and potentially their redundancy entitlements if that additional 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, weeks pushes them into a new anniversary year. So you need to watch that very carefully. One thing that we would suggest is that both for redundancy and for notice, be cautious about paying over and above what the statutory or contractual entitlements are. We often say to people, this is something that you might like to just keep up your sleeve in the event that there is a claim down the track. Of course, if you do want to offer over and above, one of the things that you might consider offering is something like outplacement services or career counselling, which is something that we do as well and that we can support with, where we would actually have sessions with the exiting employee around job searching for new opportunities, reviewing their CV, all those sorts of things. In terms of entitlements in the event of redundancy, there may also be redundancy pay payable. And the table for this is quite significant. There's some examples of it there. So between 1 and 2 years, in addition to the notice, an additional 4 weeks pay, up to a maximum of 16 weeks. Interestingly, on the National Employment Standards table, if you've looked at this before, after 10 years, it drops back from 16 weeks, and that's because that's when long service leave technically kicks in. I'll talk about long service leave in a second, though. So up to 10 years service, 16 weeks, and then it drops back. Generally, but not always, this is the payments for redundancy are applicable to employees of businesses that have more than 15 employees or 15 or more employees, with regular casuals and other entities included. And the final point there is that redundancy may not be payable. For example, if the employee has rejected a suitable redeployment opportunity, the discussion could potentially be, we are offering you X, which is of the, a similar status, same pay, whatever else, to mitigate those effects. If you choose not to take that, then you are in fact resigning from the business, not being made redundant, because we have been able to secure you another role. The employer can also apply to the Fair Work Commission for an exemption if the employer is unable to pay. That would only normally apply if the business was insolvent, or if paying redundancy would push the business into insolvency. So the employer would need really strong evidence of financial position to show that they cannot pay to have that apply. Okay, and then the final thing to just talk through really quickly that is also payable to people is obviously outstanding wages, up to and including the last day that they actually work. The notice we've talked about, accrued but untaken leave plus leave loading if it's applicable. This needs to be paid on or before the employee's final day of employment. And what that means is that you can't delay the payment until the next regular pay cycle. It needs to be paid out of cycle on or before their last day of work. The final thing is around long service leave, including pro rata long service leave. So between 5 and 10 years, for example, in New South Wales, if an employee was made redundant, they would also be entitled to their pro rata long service leave. It does vary by state. So that needs to be checked for legislation outside of New South Wales. I think they're all of the points that I needed to cover off, and I know that there was a lot in that. So I think we're now going to go to any questions that you might have, either through the chat, through raising your hand on the screen, or just call them out if you would like to.
Thank you, Margot. We are a small group, so feel free to unmute yourself if you do have a question. Keeping in mind that all that material that Margot just went through, it's in the presentation, which I'll forward you a copy of within the next couple of days. Okay, it doesn't look like it. We've either done a great job, Margot, or everybody's fallen asleep. I'm not sure which. I'm
Thanks.
hoping we've done a good job. All right. Well, we might move on. Thank you. So, just where to from here, or what other opportunities for support are there? So we do send out regular newsletters, usually only one or two a month. That's probably how you found out about this. So keep an eye out on those for further details. We do have a Facebook and LinkedIn page, so feel free to like and follow us on there if you want to keep up to date. We will also within the next couple of days be sending you a copy of our terminating employment guide, which includes some of the information we've shared with you today in relation to redundancies, but it also covers how to manage your risks in relation to terminations for reasons of poor performance or misconduct. So we're quite pleased with that little guide. So hopefully you'll find that to be useful as well. Okay, next one, Margot.
Yeah, can I just add to that a little?
Please. Yep.
Sorry, I was just going to say one of the things that we can also support you with, particularly through this process. Well, we can certainly help you from a strategic perspective with the actual redundancy restructure itself, but we can also provide you, in addition to advice on the process, with things like draft scripts, letters, involvement in the meetings. If you would like us to be, we can be present for those meetings. We don't take away from your role. The person, after all, works for you, but we can support you through that process by being physically present as well. And as I said, the outplacement and career coaching stuff as well.
Yep. All right. Great. Thank you, Margot. And another way that we can potentially support is with our small business HR compliance scorecard. So it's free, it's confidential, it's been recently updated to cater for the changes in legislation. It's a self-assessment process. You go through about 20 questions, I think it is, and you get a nice report that basically will help you highlight any areas of potential risk that may need further research or discussion. So encourage you to have a look at that. And if you have done it in the past, there have been some significant changes to legislation over the last couple of years. So I'd encourage you spending, 5 to 10 minutes completing it again. Okay, and of course we are here for you as and when you need us. So please feel free to reach out. There's also information on the Fair Work website, it's pretty good, I've got to say. There's some good resources on there. Get on there and have a browse. If you get lost or you need more specific support, please do reach out to us. Just finally, we will open it up for questions again in the event there's any last minute things. Thanks for your nice comment, Melissa. But also, if you do, whether you tell us now in the chat or whether you send us something later, we are keen on doing more of these. I think this is about our fourth one. We started them about mid last year, our free webinars. We've had some good feedback, but we want to make sure that they're of value to you. So if you've got any specific topics that you'd like us to cover in a future webinar, please do let us know, because as I say, we want to be delivering something of value to you. Okay, final chance, folks. Any questions? Okay, doesn't look like it. So thanks for joining us, folks. I hope you found it to be useful. It's been nice to see you online, and we look forward to continuing to support you into the future. And keep an eye on your emails for a copy of the presentation, the recording, and so on. Thanks very much and have a great day.